Hello, everybody. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today, our topic is IVDR readiness, creating a blueprint to build a strong performance evaluation report. Our presenter today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. And her strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I will turn it over to Sarah to give an overview of our session today. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Olivia, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. So the IVDR has a lot of companies scrambling, and we're starting to feel a little bit disorganized. And I think a big part of that is because this new regulation includes so many technical documents as well as this performance evaluation report. But they don't really explain how all these pieces fit together. So given the large volume of submissions that these notified bodies are expected to review and the relatively short review times, having a very well-organized PER and clarity for what the purpose of each of these documents is will be critical to the success of your application. So that's ultimately our purpose behind today's webinar, is to discuss the process of writing a PER with careful attention to the planning. And we also want to discuss the importance of aligning all of these technical documents so that you can create a cohesive and well-organized report. Based on our experience with both MDR and the IVDR, we're going to discuss some of the issues regarding timelines and resources, and also some strategies to help you build a strong foundation to support your IVDR writing team. So we hope by the end of today's presentation, you'll have a better sense of the critical inputs that are necessary and the common gaps that the notified bodies are reporting based on the early feedback we're getting. And then finally, hopefully to provide some steps that you can take now to help to mitigate some of these gaps and align your technical documents. So as you're all aware, IVDR states that the clinical evidence shall support the intended purpose of the device as stated by the manufacturer and should be based on this continuous process of performance evaluation, following your performance evaluation plan. This all appears in this Article 56 of the IVDR and also a description in Part A of Annex 13. So the performance evaluation process itself should be well-defined and methodologically sound, and you're expected to demonstrate three things: scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. But based on some of the early feedback that you can see here, that bar on the left represents the main source of deficiencies that BSI has noted in the first round submissions under the IVDR. And they largely fall under the reporting of clinical evidence in the PER. The technical documentation so far has been variable in terms of the quality and the completeness, and they are definitely noting a lack of consistency across these documents. So that's why we wanted to discuss the importance of having a solid performance evaluation plan in helping you to avoid being in those same group. So here at Criterion Edge, we often say that the PER has just one job. It must present sufficient evidence to demonstrate that your IVD performs as intended based on the intended purpose that you've defined. So presumably you and your team have been working and preparing for these IVDR transition activities for a while now. And most people have started with their tech files, so assembling and updating documents as you prepare to implement these new processes in your quality systems. And in many cases, we're finding that these documents are being compiled across teams in multiple divisions within your organizations. So that can certainly complicate the overall process. And as we all know, that evaluation for process for an IVD can already be incredibly complex, and there can be some unanticipated surprises and potentially delays. So we really want to drive home the point that having a solid performance evaluation plan is essential. The best analogy that I can give for the performance evaluation plan is that it represents a blueprint for your submission under the IVDR. So suppose your goal is to build a house. You wouldn't start to build a house without a blueprint. So the same is true of the performance evaluation process. So where do we start? Ultimately, the PER must demonstrate performance of the IVD when used as intended. Do you know your intended purpose? If you're building a house, it's important to think about who's going to use that space and how you intend to use that space. Because I think we can all agree that in general, a studio apartment is not going to serve the same intended purpose as a 3-bedroom home. And similarly, your device may have a very simple, straightforward intended purpose representing that studio apartment. Your IVD may be established and standardized, and those are what we commonly refer to as a legacy device. However, just because a device is standardized and considered to be a legacy does not mean you don't need to follow the same plans and procedures as a new build. You are expected to meet the same requirements under the IVDR as any other IVD. And there's really no way to get around the need for a plan or to allow you to anticipate the inspection process. The process can certainly be simplified for some IVDs compared to others, but the overall process cannot be ignored. So as you ask yourself, what is my intended purpose? Pay careful attention to the language that you're using. The language you use to define your intended purpose informs the scope of your systematic literature reviews, as well as the types of data that you will be collecting. Again, think about the intended purpose of a building. Is it a single family home or is it a 2-family flat? A single family home would require 1 kitchen and a multifamily home would require more than 1. So if you have multiple intended purposes, having clinical data and analytical data to support each of those purposes is critical. You must support each independent claim. And you wouldn't buy an apartment and build a kitchen in only one of the 2 units. And if one kitchen happens to be vastly superior to the other in 2 identical units, an outside observer will pick up on that. So finding balance in the amount of data that you're presenting for multiple intended purposes is going to be extremely important. And another thing to take into account is that not all performance objectives are relevant if your device is qualitative versus quantitative. So for instance, you wouldn't expect to identify linearity data for a qualitative assay, but the limit of detection would still be a relevant performance objective. And if your IVD happens to be a Class A, you may not be expected to present clinical performance data. But if you are noticing that you are not required to present data regarding one of these intended purposes, it's very important that you state that and that you explain that to the notified body. So BSI has published some very helpful insights regarding their expectations for the performance evaluation under the IVDR. The regulation is essentially describing the evaluation of 3 sets of performance characteristics as related to the intended purpose. These elements are listed in Annex 1 of the IVDR, and the classification must be appropriate based on the specific disorder, condition, or the risk factor of interest that you're intending to detect. So consider all aspects of the intended purpose statement when you're trying to determine your approach for performance evaluation. According to Annex 1, the intended purpose should describe the analyte. You want to provide evidence of that association between the analyte and the condition in your scientific validity report. The intended purpose should also cover the function of that analyte, which again will be described and characterized in the scientific validity report, but you should also be prepared to validate that evidence within your own clinical performance report. And then describe which conditions, or whether it's one condition or multiple, that your test is applicable for, and provide evidence of the association between your analyte and each of those conditions within both the scientific validity report and the clinical performance report. You want to pay attention to whether or not your device is automated or qualitative versus quantitative, and also pay careful attention to the specimen type, because that can vary from device to device. You must verify that your device can detect the analyte in the specimen of that type and provide that validation data. And just as importantly is the testing population. Are you validated for a general population, or are there specific patient groups for whom testing may have some challenges? That will all be described within the state of the art, which can be carried through in both the scientific validity report as well as the CPR. And then finally, don't forget to mention who is intended to use your test. If you are near patient, or if you are laboratory professional use, that will inform your choice of competitors. So ultimately, understanding where your device falls and how you will answer each of these questions will help you understand the risk to the patient or public health as a whole if your device is being misused or if you are going to have a misdiagnosis as a result of your test. So now that we've tried to define that intended purpose, now that you know what your purpose is, where do you start? Well, just as with a building, the building is only as strong as its foundation. And a performance evaluation report also needs a strong foundation. There are specific minimal building codes and standards that you have to meet, and those standards will vary based on the purpose of the building. Some buildings will require a more complex or sturdy foundation than others. So from both a technical perspective as well as an IVDR perspective, this is what we refer to as the state of the art. The state of the art will embody what's currently and generally accepted as good practice in technology and medicine. It doesn't necessarily mean the most technologically advanced solution. So a foundation can be solid without using the most current building materials, but the choice of those materials needs to be justified and supported within your building plans. But this is also a good time to point out that there's actually no clear definition of state of the art in the IVDR or in current commission guidance that addresses this particular topic. Instead, they refer to IMDRF guidance, which I have uploaded here, which provides the following definition. And that definition happens to be identical to the ISO definition, which is described in medical devices. The state of the art is defined as the developed stage of technical capability at a given time as regards products, processes, and services based on the relevant consolidated findings of science, technology, and experience. The ISO standard also gives us some helpful methods for what can be leveraged to actually establish the state of the art for a device to help you build that solid foundation. So these can be standards or best practices as identified in clinical practice guidelines. They can also be the results of accepted scientific research or publications from authorities or additional information from similar products. And finally, you want to compare the benefits and risks of the device under development with the benefits and risks of similar devices that are already available on the market. So, okay, now we know what the intended purpose is, and we've started to capture the state of the art. Your next step really is to justify the scientific validity of the IVD. So think back to your intended purpose again. In this case, I've shown different examples that can all potentially serve as a home, but clearly there are additional considerations that distinguish between them. A recreational vehicle will not have the same amenities as a tiny house, but they both have the advantage of improved mobility. A lighthouse can be used as a house, but there's certainly another more important purpose that dictates the need to take on this unique style. So the intended purpose of each of these homes, while they're all homes, they all share very unique challenges, and you must establish, is this a scientifically valid approach for serving this intended purpose? Does evidence exist that supports the utility of this approach? And ultimately, that's what IVDR refers to when they say scientific validity. Scientific validity ultimately represents one aspect of clinical evidence. So clinical evidence in total represents the sum of analytical performance, clinical performance, and that scientific validity. Now, that's compared to clinical utility, and clinical utility encompasses the overall usefulness of the results obtained from testing with an IVD. So this is a point that's often confused among clients. We found that in many cases, the performance objectives that are being captured are focused around things like the economics of the test or the timing of the test. If you are collecting data regarding clinical utility and it's not necessarily clinical evidence, that could lead to data insufficiencies. So the general recommendations from BSI clearly state that scientific validity and clinical performance are the only aspects of clinical utility that should be considered within the performance evaluation. Scientific validity itself, as we all know, is the association of an analyte with a clinical condition or a physiological state. It's often identified through academic research and can be supported by studies, including preclinical studies, that evaluate the use of that analyte for potential clinical applications. Conducting a literature review and, where applicable, feasibility or scientific validity studies can help you establish scientific validity. If you're lucky, your analyte has a well-established scientific validity. But for some of the newer IVD devices that are developed, they may be developed when scientific validity is still an emerging concept. So for instance, if you have a newly characterized biomarker, it may be potentially useful in monitoring the recurrence or progressive disease of a patient with cancer, but it might not be completely validated. So your scientific validity report is extremely important in that instance. You may need to present a greater amount of that preclinical data to justify the scientific validity of your device. So when planning your scientific validity, be prepared to address certain key aspects, including the analyte claims. So analytes must be listed with distinct literature or data to support the association with any of the claims that you're including. You'll also be addressing condition claims. So discuss any and all conditions, but also pay close attention to the ranges as well as the cutoffs for clinical diagnosis, because those can certainly vary depending on the condition. If you have an acute disease versus a chronic, the cutoffs you wouldn't expect them to always be the same. If you have certain patient populations, that can also occur. So pay careful attention to the testing population. If there are any limitations on the population, such as patients within a certain age or demographic, or patients with particular comorbidities, that is important to make note of within the scientific validity report. And you should provide literature or data that demonstrates that your device is suitable for testing on any of the patient types which you've included. So how do you create a plan to even begin to tackle scientific validity? Where do you start? Luckily, the MDCG has published guidance on the general principles of clinical evidence for IVDs. And that's given us a really solid guideline to follow to help us establish scientific validity, which will hopefully ensure that the approach that you're taking to establish that connection between analyte and condition is valid compared to the state of the art. The scientific validity can be demonstrated through the use of existing data where available, And the association of the analyte to the clinical condition may be well established. In that case, you may be able to use peer-reviewed literature, textbooks, historical data, and experience. Where existing evidence does not exist or is considered insufficient, or where there may be a novelty to your device, if you have a new analyte or a new intended purpose that you're claiming, that's where it will be necessary to provide a scientific rationale and potentially to generate new or additional data to support scientific validity. So this is why having a clear understanding of any and all intended purposes and populations that you are claiming is critical, and a gap analysis should be performed early to identify whether or not additional evidence is required. So examples of existing data that you may come across are things like appraised literature data or peer-reviewed data, published clinical data that can be from registries or databases, as well as that relevant information on the scientific validity, which could include some proof of concept studies. But notice in this figure that they show the arrows circling potentially. This is an iterative process. It's not linear. The information that you gather during the course of reviewing the scientific validity may change your intended purpose, your scope, or even your conclusions. And this is often why companies actually begin with the SVR early in their preparation processes, so that they can better anticipate changes that may be necessary prior to actually planning clinical performance studies. So consider how much is enough. Do you really need a big house, or is a smaller one sufficient? How big does your report need to be? That can be hard to know, and it's really hard to gauge how much data will be enough. So again, pay attention to the purpose of your device. If your intended purpose is very broad or ill-defined, there's a good chance that you could need to keep adding to your report after the fact, and that can lead to costly additions. So think about if you don't anticipate the need for an additional bedroom, if you're adding it on after the fact, that's going to be far more costly with time and resources than if you build it the way you intend from the get-go. So let's now talk about how to avoid those types of change orders before you actually start your data collection process. First off, start with your foundation. Have you established scientific validity? And have you established the scientific validity for the analyte with a clinical condition across all intended purposes? This requires a thorough systematic literature review, as well as a strong knowledge and appreciation for the current state of the art. This is not just one search. So we've conducted several webinars explaining the importance of systematic literature review and how to frame these searches. But for preparing the scientific validity report, we generally plan for 3 separate systematic literature reviews. One search to identify relevant guidelines, one search to identify data regarding the state of the art, and one search to identify relevant competitor data. If you have gone through this process and collected all of the information, and then appraised and analyzed that data, and you can show that you can support scientific validity, you can proceed. But if you get to the point where you've evaluated the data, you may find that there are gaps for certain intended purposes that you're claiming, and that may require revisions. So if you're satisfied with the plans to justify the approach that you've taken, you can then proceed to the next step. The next step is going to be that analytical performance. So think of this as the main floor. Does your house serve the basic needs of a house? Is it functional? At this stage, you just have to show that the report itself, that the device itself does what you claim. It can detect the analyte using a technology or an approach that is scientifically valid. So in essence, you want to show that the plan you've proposed in your performance evaluation plan allows you to successfully achieve the analytical performance that you are claiming. You want to see, will it work as intended if you build it and you conduct these experiments on site using your contractors and tools, your labs and lab technicians? Now, this might not be the right house for everyone though. And so there could be some more high-tech houses available, and that's okay. You don't have to be state-of-the-art, meaning you don't have to be the best of the best. But at this stage, what the performance analysis is focused on is to show that analytical performance, that your device performs as intended in your laboratory setting under ideal circumstances. So what does this actually mean? How do you do that? Again, I refer you to BSI, who's provided some really helpful insights in one of their recent white papers. The APR is expected to address three main areas. That's the assays, so justifying the specimen type, the storage and handling, the transport, but then also the accuracy of the test in terms of the analytical performance. So these can be things such as trueness, but it's important to make note of the reference methodology that's being used. It can also be repeatability and reproducibility, analytical sensitivity, interference or cross-reactivities that you've identified, as well as the range for which measurements can be accurately made. So this can include things like linearity and also the limit of detection or the limit of quantification, if appropriate, as well as cutoff values. Then next, you also want to describe any controls or calibrators so that you can describe the traceability and the homogeneity of your controls. And then finally, justify the choice of instruments and explain how the instrument-to-instrument precision can affect the results. In our experience, really, this analytical performance data is typically very well done. And it's the aspect of the PER that most IVD companies are actually the most confident with and are most comfortable with navigating on their own, because these are the fundamental experiments and proof of concept analyses that are used to establish that your assay performs as intended in your laboratory. These have been conducted in-house when the assay was originally validated. So it may be necessary to update some of these experiments, but generally speaking, you have this data. So conversely, the clinical performance studies represent that real world data. Suppose you have a model home that you've built in your facility with your team, and then you decide, I'm going to sell kits for this home. There could be unique challenges when an end user who's not one of your team members tries to use your kit in the real world. It could be environmental, meaning that you have to have a specific type of soil in order to build this home, or certain environmental conditions. Or it could just be user error. That represents real world data, and therein lies the issue. Because according to feedback from BSI, clinical performance studies are a quite frequent gap in the technical documentation reviews, primarily because these clinical performance studies were initially performed to meet the requirements of IVDD, not the IVDR. So the majority of existing or legacy devices have relied strongly on scientific peer-reviewed literature as their main source of clinical performance data. But if, unfortunately, limited data is available, that can put you at a very distinct disadvantage. So this, again, is why it's so important to find any and all of this elusive clinical performance data, but also to be able to identify whether or not this meets the standards, because a clinical performance study should be performed based on the ISO standards for that device. The risk analysis and the intended purpose should also inform the manufacturer within which environment studies should be conducted and whether or not near patient or self-test validation is required. These are all aspects that may be missing in the published clinical literature and may require additional assistance and additional studies to be conducted. You can also certainly use peer-reviewed literature. The peer-reviewed literature will be clinical evidence that can be gathered through published data, and you should be prepared to justify an objective method that's used to conduct these searches using databases to identify any and all published clinical literature. You can also use clinical texts as relevant to support the clinical performance of the device based on the intended purpose. And then finally, you may identify published routine diagnostic testing. And that can even include things like reports from government agencies such as the World Health Organization or European agencies and country-specific agencies. Those are ideal sources of device performance data. Clinical performance is distinct from scientific validity, though, and you need to remember that this should be valid for current European practice. You wouldn't use an outdated building standard, nor would you use a building standard for a different state or country. Trying to build a home in Europe and using American standards is not appropriate, and it wouldn't be appropriate here. So just because you have submitted under the FDA, there are specific requirements here that you should take into account that are unique to the IVDR. The PE plan must reflect clinical performance today based on the current intended use, not your historic use, and it should reflect the current state of the art. So justify how you will develop your blueprint now, not how you developed it originally 50 plus years ago when your device first hit the market. So collectively, the goal is to get to the point where you can create a performance evaluation report. The manufacturer should be compiling evidence, determining the benefit, risk, and document the performance evaluation and its output in this report. So in our analogy, the performance evaluation report can kind of be thought of as a bid for a project. So you'll include that detailed blueprint for the planning, but you'll also include descriptions of all of the materials and inputs and a justification for the overall approach that you've taken to ensure that your final product meets standards and actually performs as intended. And this bid, this whole process will be reviewed by experts who are looking for any and all gaps in the description of your process, but also in the data that you are reporting out. So when you are determining whether or not you have this big picture in mind, you're going to assess all relevant scientific validity, analytical, and clinical performance data to verify the applicable conformity of the device with the general safety and performance requirements set out under Annex 1. So does your plan support conformity with these GSPRs? Does your intended purpose require more details, analogous to adding additional rooms with additional functions? Or perhaps you have a well-established device, meaning including a singular purpose is perfectly sufficient. But just a word of caution, if you do have multiple intended purposes, ask if each of these intended purposes can be independently supported by available data. Promising a 3-bedroom apartment, but then failing to complete one of the rooms will not go unnoticed. If there's a gap or deficiency, call it out, describe it directly, and be prepared to provide a solution to address this data gap as part of your performance evaluation plan. And then finally, the report should provide that connection between these independent standalone reports. And this is where the state of the art can once again be that critical foundation on which your PER is built. There are several key considerations to take into account when you are assessing whether or not your IVD is state of the art. So ask yourself if it's compliant with the latest international standards. Is the analyte considered to be state of the art for specific conditions, or have additional analyte options emerged? Is the measuring range or the test calculation considered to be state of the art, or are more sensitive tests available? Is your device type or test currently recommended by clinical practice guidelines and European clinical practice guidelines? And then finally, how does your device compare when you're comparing it to devices that are similar, your competitor devices on the market? Those are all key aspects of the state of the art. The scientific validity report, the APR, which is analytical performance report, and the CPR, these are each standalone reports, and they're built during the performance evaluation process. But you still need to connect the levels and ensure that there's consistency between these reports. You wouldn't want to build a building without stairs connecting the levels that allow you easy access to each of the levels. And you also wouldn't want to have a house where one level clearly has a different style and choices and isn't continuous with the style of the other levels. It's extremely important to pay attention to the continuity between these reports and the consistency, because you should be prepared to fully support the connections between the data within the PER. If you're missing a step and you don't connect those dots, it will not go unnoticed. And that's a very common consideration that BSI has noted recently. A lack of consistent data supporting the scientific validity, the APR and the CPR can make it hard to justify your device as being state of the art when it's subjected to close inspection by the notified body. So at the end of the day, it's important to keep in mind the full picture. Through many of the conversations with the companies who've already submitted under the IVDR, we've found one common theme that keeps emerging, and it's that need for a plan, a strong foundation, and a current knowledge of best practice. But they also discuss the need for these skilled subcontractors. You have to have people who are experts on each aspect of this process. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a general contractor there to ensure alignment between the plans from one room to the next, the report can feel disjointed. So for most companies, the project teams that you have represent your subcontractors. Those can be the folks in research and development who will have a lot of the analytical performance data. The folks in marketing often know your competitor landscape. And then your regulatory team is tasked to make sure that all of these pieces are fitting together and often can provide insights into those hazards or risk assessments. These teams are clearly skilled experts in their specific areas of the process, but they can't support all aspects of the full PER. You wouldn't ask a plumber to build the foundation. And ultimately, given the frequently cited lack of clinical performance data, it's extremely critical to work with an experienced medical librarian who has that level of detail to allow you to efficiently identify any and all published clinical data that meet the requirements under the IVDR. The blueprints themselves represent a level of expertise too. An architect draws up plans to ensure that all of the information is presented in a clear, well-organized manner, and that supports the integrity of the PER. So having a solid template that you trust to build your PER off of is also critical. So our main takeaway that we're hearing from early adopters of the IVDR is that it's important to know what your end product will look like before you start building. Take into account what we've learned from the medical device world and our friends who made the transition from MDD to MDR. The IVDR is very prescriptive, and they will provide you some very specific information regarding what's expected. But this is a process, and change orders can occur. But just as a change order or a change in your intended purpose from what you thought it was to what you can support with the data, that can be costly, just as a change order in construction can be costly. So look at how you can design your performance evaluation upfront to give you the best chance of success. The earlier you can conduct this state-of-the-art analysis in this competitive landscape, the earlier you can be adaptable to change orders. If you need to change your intended purpose, let's figure that out while we're still working on the foundation, not when we've gotten to the point where we're conducting clinical studies for the clinical performance report. So ultimately, that's why for many clients that we've worked with, we've noticed that systematic literature review and the SVR are high on the priority list, even before the devices are actually fully developed. During the development process of a device, that can be extremely helpful information to have, because it allows you to assess whether your device will meet state-of-the-art requirements and provide insights into the competitive landscape and the performance of your competitors. So if your device that you are building may not have sufficient evidence or may not meet or be considered state-of-the-art based on the current diagnostic landscape, It's best to know that before you've begun to assess these other levels, so that you're not adding additional reports to an incomplete or shaky foundation. So we hope today that we've gone over some of those critical inputs that are needed during the performance evaluation planning process to describe what goes into a complete and a well-organized PER. Start with your intended purpose, then build out the state of the art, which can then help you assess that scientific validity. Then you'll move on to the analytical performance of your device and the clinical performance of your device. There are some ways that you can avoid these common gaps that are seen in the PER as reported by notified bodies. Avoid having that shaky foundation. Pay careful attention to the state of the art and how you've identified the data that's supporting the state of the art. Missing data will be noticed, as well as a lack of flow and connection between the data that you're presenting in your reports. And then finally, take steps now to mitigate those gaps and to align your technical documents. Identify resources and personnel who possess each of these specialized skill sets and can act as your skilled subcontractors. Assess the current state of the art and the scientific validity as early as possible in the process, and then be ready if you identify a gap, how you're going to address that directly and provide a plan to correct that gap in the future reports.
All right, thank you, Sarah. What a great explanation and roadmap to the performance evaluation process. Thank you so much. We will now turn to our Q&A portion. And now let's get to our first question. And our first question today is from Belu. Which is correct, performance evaluation report or clinical performance evaluation report? And what about safety? So Sarah, what could you say about this?
Honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to the confusion between the MDR and the IVDR. If you look to the MDR for guidance, you can actually find a lot of helpful information that's also applicable under the IVDR. So IVDs are going to require a performance evaluation report or a PER. In the medical device world, they call that a clinical evaluation report or CER. What is unique about the IVDR compared to the medical device world is that they separate out these three standalone reports. So in the medical device world, the CER would include the state of the art section. It would include specifics about the device. It would include clinical literature reporting on that device, but it's all within the report. Whereas in the IVDR, they have actually separated it, for better or worse, into three separate reports. So you describe the scientific validity in one report, and that includes a discussion of the state of the art and your competitive landscape and all of that. That will not have any of your clinical data. And then once you want to describe your own device's performance, that will be in either the APR or in the CPR. So that's where your data live, is within the APR and the CPR. But the SVR gives you that landscape, that sort of big picture. And it is a little strange because in the MDR world, with a medical device, safety is a more direct aspect. Whereas here we're mostly talking about performance and risk, but it's risk as it pertains to an inaccurate test result. The test itself is generally not related to a safety of performing the test itself, unless it's an invasive test or something like that. But the idea is that, the sample has already been collected, and so you're just testing it. So we often refer to the data, the objectives that we're collecting as the performance objectives, and it falls under analytical performance and clinical performance rather than safety and performance as the medical device field uses.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Moving on to our next question from Sergio. And he's asking, what are the specifics for software as a medical device?
So this can definitely be challenging. In many cases, the performance objectives are very unique, and but they're also in a way very prescriptive. You kind of know what to be on the lookout for depending on what type of software you're using, and you also want to know which what your actual requirements are going to be in terms of assessing risk for that software. So we actually had a recent webinar that one of my colleagues put on surrounding software as a medical device. So I will ask Olivia to help us. Oh, perfect. To pop that into the chat there. And she goes into quite a bit of detail regarding how to tackle this report from the software perspective.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. You can watch that recent webinar by clicking on the link that I just sent in the chat. All right, moving on to our next question. And Sarah, there were two questions that are pretty similar that came through, so I'm gonna pop them up together. And the first one is from Genevieve. Does the PER present the same content as the SBR, APR, and CPR, or is it a high-level summary from these three reports? And then Elaine is also asking, should the PER be a discussion of the findings of all of these reports, and how long should it be?
Yes. So in both cases, the answer is basically yes. So the PER will present the content of the scientific validity report, the APR and the CPR. You can certainly reference those within, and that's where cross-referencing and having a really well-organized template can help you quite a bit with the PER. It's not just simply stapling three reports together and calling it done. You are expected to synthesize that discussion because the APR is focused on the analytical performance. It doesn't mention the clinical performance. If there are aspects of interference which would directly impact clinical performance, that distinction will be made in the PER. That's where you do that deeper dive where you make those connections for them. So you can certainly pull sections and content from each of these three reports. But keep in mind, these three reports should serve as standalone documents. They should tell a story independently. Just as with a when you're writing your thesis, you will publish several articles in the course of doing your graduate work. You wouldn't just staple those three articles together and call it a thesis. You have to explain the overall process as well as the information that was garnered by that process, and then your final conclusions. So don't make them guess. If there is a particular conclusion that you want them to draw, call it out specifically. They will not extrapolate the data that you're presenting. Organization is critical. There is no standard length, but that's where it can get tricky. There's always that concern of, did I present enough data? But spending the time to organize each of these independent reports and then figuring out how to focus that discussion, that to create that sort of persuasive argument that you can be considered state of the art. That's the focus of the PER.
All right, great. Thanks, Sarah. Moving on to our next question. And the first question was sent in by Chrissy. What is required for established products already in the market? Can you please give examples? And then similarly, Raul is asking, is there any guidance on well-established technology in IVDR like there is in MDR?
So yes, so luckily we have gotten updated guidance regarding what we would classically refer to as a legacy device. There are different terms that are used in the MDR, that things like well-established or legacy, those are commonly thrown around. Here in IVDR, they are making it very difficult to say, I'm legacy and therefore I don't need to meet any of these current requirements. They have made it near impossible for you to go in and go in under the claim of being a legacy. So you're not subject to these same stipulations. And a big part of that's because they may not have appropriate clinical data and you don't know what the current state of the art is if you're comparing yourself to products that were on the market 50 years ago when your device hit the market. So if you're an established product, I think the first step you want to see is how much data is out there and has been published. Do you have pivotal clinical performance studies that exist? Do you have any clinical data that you can work with that meets the requirements under the IVDR? And then if you are a well-established technology, that will allow you to describe the scientific validity in more simple terms. But pay attention to you're well-established regarding what aspect of the intended purpose, because there are some tests that may be well-established for one intended purpose. And you'll find in the literature, people are starting to use your test for different purposes that you're not claiming that might not be well established anymore. You know, if you have like, certain pregnancy tests, like an HCG test, can be used to diagnose pregnancy, but more recently it's emerged as a tumor biomarker for different types of cancers. Is it well established on both fronts? That is something that you will need to assess in your scientific validity report. And you want to define whether or not you're going to claim all intended purposes, all uses of your device, or if you're going to limit your intended purpose. So those are the main caveats to keep in mind as you're sort of embarking down this well-established technology route. Is it doesn't buy you the ability to get out of doing the work. You're still expected to do these same searches.
All right. Thanks, Sarah, for that answer. We have a couple minutes left, so if you haven't sent in your question yet, you should try to do so before the end of our time here. And here's our next question. This was sent in by Ritu. When and how should the PMPF occur? When should the planning start, and when is it required in addition to the PSUR? And then in a follow-up question to that, Renata is wondering, how should we plan in the PER the updates for the PMPF data? So Sarah, could you talk a little bit about this topic?
Yeah, so this topic generally refers to the post-market surveillance and the post-market surveillance system that is set out in the IVDR's Article 78. The PMS system is being used to help you with that benefit risk determination, the performance evaluation, and then also your IFU, your instructions for use. So it sort of touches on many aspects and informs many aspects of the overall process. There is a requirement for a PMS plan for the device, and the content of that PMS plan has also been pretty clearly laid out in Annex 3. But you do have to summarize the results of your post-market surveillance in a report. If you're Class A or B, the PMS report should be available if any competent authority wants to see it, but the content of the report and the frequency of which the updates are necessary are not very clear. If you're a Class C or a D device, Article 81 is where the requirements are laid out, and it states that you're required to have a PSUR, a periodic safety update report, and that should include all of the conclusions from your benefit risk determination and the main findings of any of your post-market performance follow-up activities. So if you're Class C and D, you should be doing the PSUR annually. And if you are a Class D, the PSUR may also be submitted annually to the notified body. So the overall requirements for these can vary depending on your risk classification. So keep that in mind early in the process. The PSUR essentially winds up being a summary analysis of your PMPF, which is itself a summary analysis of your post-market surveillance. So there is some, some confusion about sort of why we are requiring all three of these reports, but ultimately they're serving they're sort of analyses of different pieces of data that will go into the overall document. So when you're planning the PER and your updates, just acknowledge that you're going to have this sort of like cyclic effect, that you should, if you identify new data within post-market surveillance, that should be addressed within the next performance evaluation report. So it will allow you to identify any changes in the field or emerging concepts or gaps or anything like that. And then I also see we have a question in the chat about clarifying one of the previous questions about the PER. It's not just a short summary of the reports. The easiest analogy I can give is from the medical device world. The CER, the clinical evaluation report, is a standalone document. So the reader should be able to assess start to finish all of the information that was gathered through the creation of those 3 standalone reports. These CERs and PERs are generally quite long, so I would not anticipate it to be a very short document, just generally speaking.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to pop in the chat the link to our recent webinar on post-market surveillance. I think that might also be helpful for some of all of you out there in the audience. And I think that brings us to the end of our time here today. If you still have questions on the content that we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn more about our services, again, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialists. Our contact information is on the screen here. You can send us an email to consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you everyone for attending, for all your great questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight into how to create a strong PER. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.